Welcome to today's session, Azure DevOps Duet Pordenone edition. Hopefully I got the pronunciation right there for everybody. A tale about how a development team and an operations team have to bond together and start using Azure DevOps for SQL deployments.
So for the next 60 minutes, we'll be talking about Azure DevOps, which allows you to do the full application management lifecycle, from creating a work item all the way to its release. And we'll be discussing both the cloud and on-premise versions of Azure DevOps, as well as its features, including source control, boards, pipelines, artifacts, and test plans. And at the end of this session, you will have a basic understanding of the main features of Azure DevOps and how it can be used with data platform deployments.
So in this session, one of us is from the SQL development team and the other from the SQL operations team. Our manager has decided that both teams will merge into one DevOps team, so that we're all one big happy family. In addition, we've also been asked to make it future-proof.
So in reality, this should be a real gradual process. However, since this is only a 60-minute session, we've taken it upon ourselves to speed up this process. In addition, our manager has decided that the development team lead will be the Scrum Master and the operations team lead will be the product owner.
Now, for those of you who don't know, a product owner is responsible for translating business needs into workable backlog items for Scrum sprints, which means they must speak to stakeholders at various levels within the business. In addition, they are ultimately responsible for prioritizing those items, even though they may get input about those priorities from various stakeholders.
And the Scrum Master's role is to empower the team to do those backlog items by encouraging how they work and removing any impediments if they appear.
Sander, before we go any further, let's introduce ourselves.
Yes. So I'm Sander. I am from the Netherlands. I am a SQL Server DBA and I work for Waypoint Analytical. I'm a Cloud and Data Center MVP, and I'm a major contributor to the DBA Tools project. You can find me on Twitter. I have a blog. If you have any questions after this session, please feel free to send me an email. I will try to reply as fast as I can. All the demos you'll see today, all the scripting and all that kind of stuff will be available on my GitHub page. Just go to the presentations, and then you will find this session. And you can use them, change them, and reteach them, and do whatever you want to do with them. Yeah. And now Kevin is going to do his bio, which is slightly more complicated than mine.
Well, thanks for that, Sander. And on that note, my name is Kevin Chan. I'm a senior database architect living in the Netherlands. However, as some of you can probably tell from the accent, I'm originally from the southwest of the UK. However, I live in the Netherlands due to the fact my wife is Dutch. So basically, I'm an Englishman living in the Netherlands, working for a French-based company because he met a woman in Australia. Now, whenever I say this out loud, I realize why certain people think this is complicated. So I have over 24 years experience working in IT, and over that time I've worked in various sectors, including the banking, oil, and health insurance industries. In fact, I supported companies that are in the top 10 of the Fortune 500 list. I've worked with all versions of SQL Server in one form or another, and I have various certifications, including both the old and the new style MCSE, and more recently I became a Microsoft Certified DevOps Engineer Expert, which is fairly relevant for today's session. I'm also a Microsoft Certified Trainer and a Microsoft Data Platform MVP. Now, just like Sander, you can find me on Twitter. I'm also on LinkedIn with a user-friendly URL. I have my own blog, and I have my own set of GitHub repos as well. And my email address is available upon request. Anyway, first thing to discuss, Sander, is whether to use Azure DevOps Cloud Services or Azure DevOps Server. For those of you who aren't aware of the difference, Azure DevOps Server is the new name for TFS, which is the application you install on premises to do your application lifecycle management. However, it's now been rebranded to look and feel just like the cloud-based Azure DevOps Cloud Services. Personally, I'd like to use Azure DevOps Server for security and reporting purposes. However, the downside is we'd have to build one or more servers with Azure DevOps Server installed for business continuity reasons. Plus, we may have to wait a while for new features to become available because of the cloud-first strategy. In addition to that, Sander, we'd have to maintain and patch all those servers.
But if you use Azure DevOps services in the cloud instead, you wouldn't have to patch maintain anything because it's all maintained for you by Microsoft behind the scenes. Plus, it's easier to install extensions from the marketplace.
Well, that's true, and we can still secure it in Azure. Besides, whichever we use, we must still consider security and compliance anyway to keep our auditors happy. And it's easy for us to connect Azure DevOps Cloud Services to Azure Active Directory as well, which we need to do if we want to connect some services to a Git repository within Azure DevOps. Luckily, Azure DevOps is well structured and easy to manage.
So the main point we want you to take away from this section is that if you install Azure DevOps Server, you have to patch and maintain everything yourself. Whereas with the cloud-based version, everything is done behind the scenes for you. And for Azure DevOps organizations, you need to be connected to Azure Active Directory to easily integrate services like Synapse Studio with an Azure DevOps repository.
So, just moving on from there, let's just quickly show Azure DevOps Cloud Services itself. And as you can see here, Azure DevOps has its own hierarchy. At the top, you have your service, which has access to one or more organizations, which you can see on the left-hand side here in Azure DevOps. Now, these organizations can be the company you work for, or if you're part of a large enterprise, it could be just a division within that enterprise. Or alternatively, they can be like, as you can see here, personal organizations you've created for testing. Now, if you have the right permissions, you can change various organization settings. And these settings obviously apply at the whole organization level. So for example, in the general section, you can change things like the whole organization name, which can have serious implications. You can also view which projects you currently have in your organization and do some things with those as well. You can also view other things like auditing, usage. You can view extensions, which is quite useful, especially if you work for a large enterprise and they've limited the permissions for who can install extensions for you. And of course, as Sander was talking about just now, you can integrate with Azure Active Directory. Now you can change some security settings here. You can manage policies within Azure DevOps or fine-tune certain permissions at the organization level. You can also do a very important one relating to boards called processes, and we will cover processes a bit later in this session. But all you need to know for now is that the main place to go to customize processes is here at the organization level. Now, there's various pipeline related settings you can change at the organization level as well. As far as repositories are concerned, there's two main changes you can do at the organization level. The main one is to change the default branch name for new repositories. As some of you may already know, there's a little bit of controversy regarding to the origins of the master branch naming convention within Git. So with this in mind, Microsoft now given you the option to change the default branch name. And in fact, GitHub have taken a similar stance now. If you go and create a new repository in GitHub, the default branch name is main at this moment in time. And also, if you download a Git client onto your own machine, like Git for Windows, you will notice now that the latest versions give you the chance to change the default branch name there as well. So if we go back up to the organization, you can see that each organization can have one or more projects within them. Now, by clicking inside one of these projects, you can actually see all the features Sander mentioned at the start of the session, including boards, repos, pipelines, test plans, and artifacts. And again, if you have the right permissions, you can change settings at the project level as well. So again, you can change the name of the project. You can manage your teams here, which is quite important. So for example, if I click on the default team, I can add and remove members. I can fine-tune permissions at the project level. So if I scroll down and click on the same team again, you can see here a set of permissions that you can fine-tune. You can add service hooks or third-party applications from here. If I clicked on create subscription, you can see there's a whole host of services. There's various board settings I can change here and on a per team basis. It's easy to do it from here by clicking on the down arrow. There's various pipeline settings you can change at the project level here. And if we click on repositories, you can manage all the repositories you've got inside your project. And again, you get the option to change your default branch name if you don't have permissions to do it at the organization level. You can also do some interesting policies here if you really want to. File path validation may be one of interest to some people. You can view how much storage or your artifacts are taken up within your project. And finally, there's some test settings you can change here potentially, depending on your organization's default policies for retention settings as well.
Cool. So remember, there are other things we can configure as well if we dive even deeper into these settings. The main point we want you to take away from this section is how Azure DevOps is structured. So anyway, now we've covered the main admin stuff. Let's cover version control options with Azure Repos, which is a feature in Azure DevOps.
You mean like source safe?
Maybe something a little bit more modern, since Azure Repos supports multiple version control systems. We can do something with Git, for instance.
Well, that'll only be for your development work though, right? Because it sounds like version control would be complicated for the ops folks to learn.
Well, actually, I think that when ops teams start using version control, they will start to perform better. At the company I work for at the moment, we've started putting all our scripting, all our documentation, and other processes in version control. And that's used throughout the entire IT department. And that really showed a performance increase.
Well, I'm always going for performing better, Sandra. Tell me more. So I was smiling because I just read one of the comments in the chat.
Well, like I said, Azure DevOps supports multiple version control systems. Because we want to do something with a distributed version control system, I think Git will be the best choice for us.
Okay, so what about branching policies? Because I hear they're pretty important.
Yeah, there are various ones that we can use. For example, you have the Git flow and the GitHub flow.
Well, what's the main difference between those two? Because they sound pretty similar to me.
Yeah, they are pretty similar. And the major difference between the two is that with the Git flow, you don't directly merge into the master branch. There's always something like a development branch, unless it's a hotfix, of course. And with the GitHub workflow, there's no development branch. So all the features and hotfixes or anything that needs to get merged gets into the main branch right away after, of course, when it's successfully tested. And us devs have been using source control for a while now. So if we do something like pair programming, dev and ops can actually get used to it.
Hang on, peer programming?
No, pair programming, and not like a pair, but like pairing up, where two people write code together. And normally, before the COVID-19 situation, two people would literally sit next to each other and write the same code. And research has shown that it usually takes a bit longer to do. However, It means you end up with more stable code and people learn their coding practices better.
And that means there's a lot of overhead involved with that practice.
Yeah, you would think that, and you would be correct. Like I said, it takes a little more time to do, and there is about a 15% overhead, but that overhead is largely compensated with the increased quality of code, and which means less bug fixes, and bug fixes just cost a lot of money. Of course, there are other methods that you can use, like code reviews, which are really standard. And at the end of the day, we just have to experiment what works best in our situation.
Okay, so what's to stop somebody coding their own release and pushing it straight to the main branch?
I'm glad you asked. So Azure DevOps has something called branching policies, and one of which is that two people have to approve the updates to the main branch.
Well, that sounds good. I think we need to do that to be SOX compliant anyway, since we deal with financial data. In fact, I did look a bit at this earlier. So if we go to Azure repos, and this is a GUI visualization, basically, everybody, of how your Git repository looks when it's stored in Azure DevOps. And there's a lot of things here you can do that's similar to what you can do with the Git command line. So one of the things about being SOX compliant is that you go after 4i principle in place, and to be able to do that within Azure DevOps, you'd have, or Azure repos, Git repository, you'd have to select what's known as a branch policy. So for those of you who may have just missed it there, I'll go back to it again. So if you go to branches, click on the ellipsis, you can select branch policies. On there, to get the 4i principle working, you would set your minimum number of reviewers to 2, which means that obviously 2 sets of people have to view it. And then in addition to that, you want to make sure that a pull request is created every time. So to do this, you would automatically include reviewers. And doing this on a branch basically means that the only way to update it is for somebody to raise a pull request.
Nice. And these are the main points we want you to take away from Azure repos. Azure DevOps supports multiple version control methods. However, Git has become de facto standard nowadays, and in addition, you can secure the updates using branch policies, as you've seen Kevin just demonstrate in Azure DevOps. Git also hooks in really nicely with other tools from Microsoft, like the Visual Studio and Azure Data Studio as well.
Yeah, which I think some people may see one of those later on. Mm-hmm. So anyway, we better discuss Azure Boards, since I'm going to be using it to organize our backlog items. Now, as you may have seen earlier when I showed you the process section and the organization settings, Azure Boards can use basic Agile Scrum or CMMI based templates for each project you create in Azure DevOps. As I mentioned earlier, these templates are also called a process. Because we're using Scrum Standard, we'll probably want to use one that's related to the Scrum process. For now, we can keep it as standard, but we can customize these processes if we need to. And I'll just quickly show everybody now how our Azure Boards actually look straight out of the box. So I'm just going to quickly go through the default features here. So you've got work items, which will allow you to view all of your work items in a linear way. And it's also quite handy to go and look for any potentially removed items. So if you're worried that one's magically disappeared, you can look here for it. And then there's boards, which allows you to work in a Kanban or Scrumban kind of way. And may be familiar to those of you who have worked with other board-based applications in the past. And just like some of those other applications, you can customize various things here, like the background colors of work items based on tags, the columns used, and the swim lanes, etc. Next up, there's backlogs, and this will allow you to view all of your outstanding backlog items here in a linear format. Moving on from there is the sprint task board, and this will allow you to have just a quick overview of the sprint you're actually working on. As you can see, it can give you a little access to your burn down chart out there, depending on how you're measuring capacity. And you can do a few other things on this board as well. And then there's queries, which we will cover shortly, which allow you to create powerful queries.
Okay, very cool. But can you tell me how the backlog items are organized for Scrum?
Sure, I kind of gave it away just now, to be honest with you. So the hierarchy, if you're using the Scrum process, is that you have one or more epics, which can contain one or more features, and then from there, they can contain one or more product backlog items. Now, if we're using Agile process instead, Sander, it would actually be user stories instead of these backlog items.
Okay.
By the way, did I mention all the analytics and preview features we can potentially use?
We only have 60 minutes, Kevin, so that's not going to work.
Oh, come on. I just want to quickly demo how you can use analytics views to create a sprint review based on what it is in Azure boards. I will not take long, I promise, and I'm going to do it completely from scratch. So basically, all of these work items, Sander, we can present as analytics views, which is something that's currently in preview in Azure DevOps. And what I've actually just quickly done is created another two views that are literally based off existing ones that are here. So for example, if I click on this one, it'll give you a brief overview, and it just filters by sprint 18, which as some of you may have seen on the sprint task board, it's the sprint we are currently in. So if you wanted to do, for example, a sprint review, you can open up Power BI and connect to these Power BI desktop, I should say, and connect up to these analytics views. And this is the first time I'm actually doing this demo in front of a live audience, so we shall see how it goes.
Uh-oh.
And the main purpose I want to show this is to show everybody just how fast it can be to create your own sprint review dynamically using these boards, analytics views, I should say. So all I've just done there is you probably saw, and by the way, if it's too small, I'm sorry, I tried to change the environment for this earlier. Power BI desktop's a bit more particular as opposed to Visual Studio. So all I'm doing is selecting those two views, and then I'm clicking on load to load those data sets in the Power BI. Don't worry, I will make sure the text and the dashboards are user friendly. If you do want to zoom in, you can press Control in the middle mouse scroll button or Control and plus to make this all a bit bigger to zoom in and zoom. So, of course, Power BI desktop now decides to go slow now I'm here. So I'm just going to, first of all, show you how easy it is to do your own burn down chart in Power BI desktop. So I'm just going to create an area chart here. Just going to drag out a little bit to make it a bit bigger. I'm going to expand the Sprint 18 task board I created. I'm just going to select date, change it instead of showing the date hierarchy to the individual dates, put in the remaining time. And as you may or may not be able to notice, if I drag out a bit bigger here, it actually starts on 3. I don't really like the fact that it starts on 3. I'm going to make it start from 0. So I'm just going to go to the y-axis and the customization, change the start to 0. And as you can see, that is a very quick way to create your own version of a burn down chart in Power BI. From here as well, another common thing you do in sprint reviews is you go through the backlog items of which each person has done, depending on how you work with Scrum and Agile, of course. So let's look at the backlog views now, and I'm going to select assign to, and the title as well. If I drag this out a bit, I need to customize, and hopefully I can find the right column for the values. Scroll down here, and I'm going to get this to go out to 14 to make this easier for you all to see. In fact, let's go up to 16 to be a friend for us here. So we can make this a bit bigger. So we've got that, but it's quite static, it's a bit dull. And of course, if you want people viewing Power BI, you want it to be a bit more visual. So we're going to add some slicers here. And for those of you who are new to these kind of terms, a slicer is effectively a nice name for a filter. So I'm just going to do one that says assign to, so we can filter in and out of which ones are just for me and which ones are just for Sander dynamically. Then another one, I will add another filter here whilst I'm at it. And I just filter by state and drag that over. So once you've done all your filters, that's very, very quick introduction on how you can use analytics views to do your sprint review instead of using something like PowerPoint, for example. And once you've finished and you're happy with all your visualizations, you can simply go to Publish to Power BI. And that's your very quick introduction on how you can do this and how you can take advantage of analytics views, which is very, very powerful. So anyway, now the demo's out of the way, the main thing to take away from this section is that Azure Boards is a very powerful way of managing Scrum or Agile work visually, especially if you're a product owner.
So before you go into the pipelines, are there any questions? No?
Nope.
Okay, cool. So let's talk about Azure pipelines then, which is where we're going to build and deploy our deliverables.
So how would this work with SQL Server?
Well, we could to look at either deploying using state-based or migration-based deployments.
Well, what's the main difference between those two?
Well, with state-based, you have a Visual Studio project, and that is the state which will be deployed to the target. And it's mostly the destination, how it's perceived. And with migration-based, you will script out all the changes. You start at one point and you script out all the changes that happen from that point on and deploy them incrementally. So it's more the traveling itself to the destination. And migration-based can be good, but if there's a problem, we'd have to redeploy all over again. And I think with our situation, with our database, state-based would be better for us. By the way, there are a lot of articles on the internet with state-based versus migration-based, and they both have their pros and cons. So be wise and look into that before you do anything with that.
Yeah, and just to give you an example, I have once been involved in a project to deliver a database to a full-figure number of SQL servers using state-based migration. So that is itself good for scale. Sorry, Sander, over to you.
No problem at all. So it's pretty easy to build a pipeline for SQL Server updates, as I can demonstrate right now. So I need to get presenter view.
Should have had a photos up. Can we get the screen changed over? Don't click on the red cross. That doesn't mean to stop. It doesn't mean what you might think it means.
I think Mike has to make me a presenter.
So with the view I've got, it seems to be fairly easy. It's underneath my camera. I'm not sure where it's located to on your screen because obviously I can't see it.
Mike, I need to get presenter mode.
Do I have to?
Mike?
Oh, I can make you a presenter. Sorry, everybody. I just realized I shouted in the mic. I've just made you a presenter, Sander.
Thank you. So I'm going to share my screen. And if I'm right, you can see my Visual Studio Code window right now. Right?
Yep, I can see your screen.
Okay, cool. So I am a very lazy person when it comes to repetitive tasks. So when I had to create our state-based Visual Studio projects, it was kind of getting tedious because I had to do this about 35 times. So what I did was I made one project exactly how I wanted to have it, and then used the PS module development PowerShell module to create a template out of that entire directory structure. And then with some tweaks, I was able to perfect that template, and now I can just run a very simple command, and all the scripting you see here is just downloading, extracting, and installing that template. But the most important part is this little piece of tech, this little command right here, invoke psmd template. And that command will create my entire SDT solution in a matter of seconds. And what will happen is you will get something like this. And this is the entire SDT solution. And I want to emphasize that including in this template, you will have an Azure DevOps pipeline as well as a GitHub Actions workflow. So you can use this project for both Azure DevOps and GitHub. If we go into that solution, and I'm going to move the presenter view a bit, then I have two projects in here. And that is because I want to separate my data model from my unit tests. And if you're not already unit testing your database, you probably should. So here's my data and here's my unit tests. And I don't have to, I can just reference the data model into my unit tests. So if I do a deployment from there, I can just, I have the same objects as my data model. So it's really easy to do deployments as well. So there we go. So yeah, back to you, Kevin. Kevin?
Oh, you finished?
Yeah.
Good. Anyway, I was going to ask you about unit tests because I know we can do that for other programming languages within Azure DevOps.
Yeah, we can. So what we can use is something called tsqlt. And tsqlt is a framework for unit testing for SQL Server databases developed by Sebastian Main. It's an open source project. And I like tsqlt because it keeps the developer in its tsql bubble. They don't need to learn another language like C# or PowerShell or do anything with that. So they just write tsql code. However, if I want to do all kinds of basic unit tests with my database, like check if all my tables are there, does my table have the correct columns, does my store procedure have the correct parameters, etc., 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 that is going to be a lot of copy and pasting. So again, I was lazy as hell, and I created a PowerShell module that does that for me. It's called the PSTSQLT test generator. It's on the PowerShell gallery as well. And what this will do is it looks at the current state of your database and then loops through all the objects and then generates unit tests for them. And that looks a bit like this. So if I go in and I look at one of my tests, one of which is really important is the database collation. I want to be sure that if I do any deployment, the collation of my database is actually the one that I'm expecting. Another one is that I mentioned before is if my table exists. So if my table is obviously disappeared for some reason, then this should generate an error. The same thing with the parameters for a store procedure. It just generates this all for you. And this really helps you to get started using T-SQL-T unit tests. And you should do unit testing with databases nowadays, just to make sure that your deployments will work throughout your entire test, acceptance, and production servers. So
that's fair enough.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Anyway, I was just going to ask, because I was just doing some stuff in Azure DevOps, so you're doing that, and I've seen we can use either GUI tasks or YAML for our pipelines. Which should we use?
Well, the GUI is good for exploring things when you're not familiar with YAML, but in the end, I would just rip the Band-Aid off and start using YAML, because if you kind of look at code, it's not that difficult to learn. Besides, if you do anything with the marketplace, it gets translated to YAML anyway. So if you put in, you want to add another extension, you put in the values and it gets transformed into YAML into your pipeline straight away.
Well, that's true. And I remember actually you showed me about that earlier. And that's one of the reasons why I was a bit distracted just now, because whilst you were explaining about T-SQL-T, I multitasked a bit and I experimented with the YAML pipeline that you created. Luckily, I'd already created something called an agent locally, which we will cover shortly. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to take back the screen, hopefully.
I'm going to stop sharing.
So I do believe you may need to make me a presenter again.
Yeah, how do I do that? Make presenter. There you go. You are now a presenter.
And it's gone straight to the screen. Yeah, this is good.
Nice.
So, like I said, luckily I created something called an agent locally. So what I'm going to first of all do, this is one of the projects that Sander created just now, basically. And I'm just going to create a column here. This is, by the way, everybody, Azure Data Studio, for those of you who may never have seen it before. If you have this certain extension installed, you can actually work with database projects in Azure Data Studio. I highly recommend getting used to Azure Data Studio. It's got a lot of advantages. And if you've ever heard anyone mention about notebooks, this is the application to use to work with them in. So back to this, and I've just made a change to a column here in the database project. I've just saved it. And because Azure Data Studio recognizes source control, it can recognize that I've changed the column. So I'm just going to commit that change to my local Git repository. So the repository you saw earlier in Azure repos, I have a local copy of, which is called a clone. I'm just going to click on sync, which effectively will do a merge, so to speak, between what's local on my machine and what's in Azure DevOps. So if I go back here now and click on refresh, it will start the pipeline running. And whilst it's running, I can talk through with you, Sander, what I actually did. So I took the initial build and unit testing stages that you created. And the first thing I did, I decided, because I wanted to deploy the SQL 2019, I removed the default SQL Server 2017 unit tests. And I moved the unit tests to local just to speed things up a bit. And from there, I created 3 additional SQL Server 2019 environments to deploy to. And these are based on integration, staging, and production environments. So for those who aren't aware, these are typical environments that you find in a deployment pipeline. Integration environments is where you tend to do your integration tests. after unit testing. So basically unit test each component. Integration tests is to check that all those components work with each other and other things as well. And then from there, once that's completed, as long as it's completed well, I got it to do a deployment to another SQL Server 2019 instance that represented a staging environment. And the staging environment is where you tend to do your user acceptance tests. And then finally, from there, as long as the user acceptance test went well, it deployed to a SQL Server 2019 instance, which represented a production environment. And I actually did all of this testing locally using Docker containers, which I can show you here. So it's just running these containers you can see in Docker dashboard. However, after I'd done that, Sander, I thought, well, that's all well and good, but what about, say, for example, if I want to synchronize with GitHub? So I then set it up to synchronize with a GitHub repository, which would then fire off a GitHub action, which then done another update to another SQL Server database elsewhere. And that went well. So I thought, well, if I can synchronize with GitHub within a pipeline, what else can I do? So I went to deploy to an Azure SQL database. However, originally I had some compatibility issues. So what I had to do behind the scenes is find a way to convert your database project to be ready to be deployed to other Azure-based solutions. Now, one way I could have done it is to have created multiple projects in Azure DevOps. But however, as you know, if you want consistency, you're going to have to keep remembering to update every single different project, which can be cumbersome, and eventually there is going to be some drift. Let's set that realistic expectation there if you go down that route. So what I did instead, and I can actually show you this now. I actually came up with this method to actually convert the project behind the scenes instead. So what happens here, this is YAML, by the way, everybody. So it is literally a definition file, it can be multiple files. So behind the scenes, what I did, Sander, in this particular stage, I copied the files first. So I copied the whole project to a secure location, which is actually a subfolder in the artifacts directory. From there, I ran a piece of PowerShell, which literally just updated one line in the SQL project file. And then I built that project based on the rename line in the SQL project file. And then I published that as an additional DAT pack. So if we go back here again in a minute, I will show you where the extra DAT pack is. And then from there, it's just a regular deployment to an Azure database. So if you see at the top, you can see so far it's published 3 DAT packs because that's what it does in those build stages. And then from there, as you can see, it's deployed from a database project initially based for SQL Server on premises to an Azure SQL database and an Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool. And just to show there is no smoke and mirrors here, and it did literally deploy updates to all of those different types, I can show you them all now. So here's the integration database that got updated. You click on one of these other ones. Here's the staging one, production database, and the other database from the GitHub action are both on this production container representing a production environment. Here is the Azure SQL database, as you can see by the slightly changed logo here. And here, click on refresh. And it's not going to show me now because I'm doing a live demo. However, I can quickly show you elsewhere. So what I will do quickly for you all now What I'm doing, for those of you who don't quickly see it, I'm just opening up an Azure Synapse Analytics workbook here. And what I'm going to do, because this is quite small, I've just taken it away from another screen. So I can click on data view. You can see there's a database. Here's the pool. Here's the tables. And here is the change column. So as you can see, it fully works. There's no smoke and mirrors here, just a bit of imagination, and you can use the very same Git repository that you have running in Azure DevOps from that one single source, deploy to all these different database types without having to manage multiple ones. So
Okay. That's all good and well, but if the dedicated SQL pool matches this schema, what if we want to make it optimal for Azure Synapse Analytics?
well, if we wanted to do that, we could just create another pipeline, and it uses a similar method I just showed everybody just now. But instead of doing that to change the SQL file, you can use it to change the SQL database file and do things like change your replication strategy, etc.
Okay. So I think it's great that we can do the T-SQL-T test on a database project that will end up in a dedicated SQL pool. It just takes a bit of imagination. So plus you have to take the SQL pool schema into consideration.
Yeah,
which Kevin will put into the chat.
I'll put it in the chat at the end of the session. So
yeah.
Anyway, you were going to mention, is there any other way we can do deployment, Sander, if you want to deploy? Because this is obviously for like only one SQL server at a time. So we can do it to multiple servers at scale?
Well, we can do that. We can use something like PowerShell instead to handle the YAML, to handle the deployments if we're dealing with a large number of servers.
How do we know if that worked?
Well, we could get PowerShell to simply output the XML in a JUnit format and then have Azure DevOps use that XML in a task which publishes the XML, which will produce a visual result of all the tests. There are other feedback mechanisms in place that we can use for deployments as well.
We can do that?
Oh, yes, we can.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, so if we go to edit a pipeline, like use the pipeline I just showed you, or showed just now, the YAML code, for example, because I got a quick question for you about this. So if we go back to this, are we just limited to all these tasks that we see on the right-hand side here?
No, you can install loads of additional extensions from the marketplace. Of course, because we are an enterprise company, we'd probably want to have to request that to the team that handles that manages the Azure DevOps organization, because just installing that without their permission would not be a good idea.
No, I didn't realize that was a thing.
Oh yeah. It does mean that we can get help with those security and compliance issues you were talking about earlier. Plus, I get the feeling that we'll have to install the Synapse Workspace deployment extension anyway, because I know you've already been asked if it's possible to redeploy a workspace to another one. So, from what you mentioned, you can do that, right?
Yeah, I can. But that's the discussion that's definitely going to have to be for another time, because that's fairly involved. But it is possible. It just goes to show with a bit of imagination, you can do various things in your Azure DevOps pipelines. Anyway, I've seen we can use Microsoft hosted agents even within our known network on premises, which are services that Microsoft hosts in Azure to do a lot of the processing of the build and release tasks, like building various artifacts and deploying them. So basically, agents are fundamental if you're going to do Azure pipelines. They're essentially they're required to do all the hard work. So all those tasks have to be done somewhere, and they're done on these agents. However, Sander, it appears that because of our infrastructure, we'd have a lot of issues internally if we use the Microsoft hosted ones. For example, we'd have to raise a lot of firewall requests. So maybe we're better off building our own agents internally.
Maybe, but remember, a lot of us are developers and we don't build our own servers. Plus, we'd have to figure out exactly what software to install and on those agents and maintain them. Oh, cool.
As I hope you can all see on this screen here, Microsoft provides guides on how you can create your own images based on the various agents in GitHub. The name of the guide repository may be a bit confusing, and that's because it was originally just designed for Azure DevOps agents. After once GitHub introduced GitHub Actions, Microsoft realized they could actually use the same images for both, which is now why it's now called GitHub Actions Virtual Environments.
Well, if we're going to do that, we might as well run the agent through the command line instead of using it as a service.
How come?
Well, everybody knows that running something through the command line gives you more detailed results, right?
Well, as you know, I tested it before. So let's see the results in the next slide.
Behold. Oh. Well, next part, test plans. It's not much there. So, of course, we can do the test plans once we've done the initial build and release before we release elsewhere.
They all have to be automated though, because that would take a lot of effort for some items.
Not necessarily. Your test plans can have manual steps as well, which you can check out yourself right now.
Okay, I think I will. So if I go down to test plans then. Okay, so I can see that there's a test management system here, and from what I saw briefly earlier, Azure test plans as semi-structures are basically the smallest, lowest component is the individual test cases. Then you have a test suite, which can contain multiple test cases. And then you have your test plans, which you go to initially here, which can contain one or more test suites. And in addition, they can actually contain individual test cases as well, which is why it's semi-structured. So if I go to here now then, and I make sure I'm in the execute section and click run for web application. Oh yeah. So basically Sanders created a manual test suite for me to go through here. And if you see, as you can see here, you can include various pictures inside these as well. And you can go through and just tick on the progress. If one's gone wrong, you can say it's a problem. So for example, I click it broke. If I click on create bug, then you can automatically create a bug based on all the details here. And as you can see, we will also add your comment. So we discard the changes there. You can also take pictures along the way of what you've been doing, or you can record your steps. You can actually record with audio as well, or you can add an attachment if there's an issue. Now, I'm very briefly going through this, but there are web extensions that you can use to actually complement this as well. You can also install an application, desktop application for use instead. However, there are implications of using that, so be careful. Anyway, over to you, Sander.
So we better briefly discuss artifacts here, which is where we can share various things like NuGet packages with others. For example, if you create a NuGet package, you can share it in Azure Artifacts for others to use.
That's strange. I couldn't do anything when I tested using the organization I got for free earlier.
Yeah, that's because you sometimes have to go to your Visual Studio subscription benefits page to set them up.
Okay, hold on a minute. On that note, just a reminder, like we said at the start of the session, you can create your own Azure DevOps organization to test things on. And if you have a Visual Studio subscription, that can bring additional benefits as well.
And that is just in case you want to test out things and without the fear of breaking your company's Azure DevOps organization.
Yep, and give you all now a very quick introduction to Azure Artifacts. Basically, in Azure Artifacts, you can create what's known as a feed. And for those of you who may have worked with Linux in the past, you can think of a feed a bit like a repository. And in fact, if you've used GitHub packages in the past, this is a similar thing as well. And these feeds can support various type of packages like NuGet, Python, etc. And a rather interesting one called Universal Package as well, which basically supports near enough most file types. So from here, you can download the packages, etc. as well. And that's a very quick introduction. So, to be honest, there's other features in Azure DevOps I'm looking forward to the team using as well, Sander. For example, we can use the various dashboards, and I'm convinced this one will say the wrong name. Nope, that's fine. So we can use various dashboards like this one. So we can show the sprint goal, for example, at the start of the day stand-ups if we want.
Don't forget the wiki.
Oh, yeah, that's true. So there's the wikis that you can use in Markdown language. Also, as well, there's the analytics views, which we covered earlier. And like I said, I think they're very powerful in the future. There's also an Azure DevOps extension for Azure CLI. So if anyone's using Azure CLI, there's actually an extension you can install on there. A lot of the commands on there are currently in preview, but it's still quite useful for use for anybody who's keen on that.
Okay, so where shall we begin?
Well, I suggest we start by getting both teams together and trying to explain to them what we're trying to achieve.
Anyway, that's all we have time for today. I see we have a couple more minutes left. So if there are any questions, feel free to go nuts.
Anybody can open his microphone or even the webcam if you want to participate and ask some questions to our friends Sander and Kevin. Thanks for being really fantastic performant speakers. It's been a very long and fantastic day at Data Saturday Pordenone, #1 of who knows how many. And this is the last session of the day. Do not seek questions in the chat. I think people at this time, at least in Europe, may be a bit tired, but I think all are really satisfied about the sessions like this one, very full of interesting information and very well presented. I must again say thanks to you both.
Thank you very much. Again,
fine.
if there are any questions, feel free to reach out to either Kevin or me using our channels like Twitter or our email addresses.
I'm hoping everybody minds. I'm going to whiz right back now at the start and then go through it all again just to where the details are. So, like Sander said, you can reach out to him here if anybody wants to make a note of this now or quickly find it on Twitter or LinkedIn.
If you Google our names, you'll probably find us anyway.
Nice job, guys.
All the tools of his GitHub. And obviously there's my details as well if you want to find me. Do you look for me using Kev Chant on Twitter? Kevin Chant is a completely different account, as I had explained to somebody a while ago. So if anyone has any questions or if they think of something afterwards, like we said, feel free to reach out to us. We both together have got a fair amount of experience working on this, so that's fine.
Nice job, guys.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
So
So in a minute, I will actually click on the red cross, Sander, because I know what it means.
Yeah.
And I'll go back to your details, Sander, so they can add you on Twitter or whatever, because it's harder to find you at times than me, I know. So I think with that being said, and obviously, as you all just heard, it has been a long day for the majority of you. And I hope you did all enjoy the rest of this event. I know that was mentioned just now as well. I think I am going to leave if there's no other questions from anybody.
Yeah, I'm going to leave as well. Thank you for having us, and maybe next
So
time.
thanks to all the hosts for today for having us, and obviously, yeah.
Thank you, friends. Bye. Good evening.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Good evening.
Cheers.